Lost in History, 1984, Reconstructed by Gunisha Kaur. Chapter 2, Audiobook. Broken Promises. I ask you to accept my word and the resolution of the Congress that it will not betray a single individual, much less a community. Our Sikh friend have no reason to fear that it would betray them, for the moment it does so, the Congress would not only thereby seal its own doom, but that of the country too. Moreover, Sikhs are a brave people. They know how to safeguard their rights by exercise of arms if it should ever come to that. Mohandas Gandhi. In the early 1900s, India sought to gain freedom from the British Empire, which controlled a majority of subcontinent for nearly a century. Although numerically in the minority, the Sikhs of the Indian Army displayed their strong commitment to the freedom movement by contributing more arms and men to the independence struggle than all other groups combined. The British and Indians alike recognized the Sikh community for its crucial role in winning freedom in South Asia. Over the course of the independence struggle, several propositions were made to the Sikhs in order to persuade them to break their alliance with the powerful Indian National Congress. Later renamed as the Congress Party of India, at the time of the Second Round Table Conference in 1932, the British government informally offered the Sikhs an enduring proposal. If they disassociate themselves from the freedom movement, they would be rewarded with complete sovereign control of their homeland Punjab. Although the Sikh community refused this offer, continued to fight for the independence of entire subcontinent. The British cabinet offered a second confidential proposal to the Sikh representative Baldev Singh. Under this proposition, the Sikhs would be permitted to have political feet of their own on which they may walk into the current of world history. In response, Baldev Singh informed the British government that the Sikhs intended to have their political aspirations fulfilled by the majority community and that the Congress party had promised the Sikhs a prominent independent role in the Indian government. Instead of separating from the independence movement and gaining a sovereign homeland, the Sikh community continued to fight for independence. The sacrifices of the Sikhs in the struggle for independence are displayed in this table below. Although they represented only 2% of the Indian population, Sikhs constituted 71% of the people who died fighting in the independence movement. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru acknowledged the sacrifices of the Sikhs at the Congress Working Committee meeting in Calcutta in 1946 and stated, "The brave Sikhs of Punjab are entitled to special consideration. I see nothing wrong in an area and a setup in the north wherein the Sikhs can also experience the glow of freedom." With these promises of religious homeland, the Sikhs fought the colonialists with the expectation that they would not only gain independence for India as a new nation, but also earn the freedom to express their religious beliefs within their own political domain. On August 15, 1947, the British relinquished control of its South Asian colony and the newly created nations of India and Pakistan celebrated their inceptions. Sir Cyril Radcliffe, in charge of demarcating the boundaries for the two newborn nations of India and Pakistan, drew a line across the middle of Punjab, splitting the butterfly-shaped Sikh homeland into two. This division drove Sikhs from the Pakistani side of Punjab eastwards to the Indian side of Punjab, and Muslims from East Punjab to the westward Pakistani side. The Sikhs had to abandon their fertile and irrigated lands of West Punjab and enter the boundaries of India as orphans with no government aid. Nearly 40% of the Sikh population was forced to leave their homes and an appalling 2.5% was massacred in the violent exodus from Pakistan. Upon their move to India, the Sikhs hoped to realize the promise given by Congress: freedom. Somehow, the Sikh hope for freedom proved too idealistic. A confidential memo issued by the Indian government to all deputy commissioners on October 10, 1947, a mere 8 weeks after independence from the British, demonstrates the government's true feelings towards the Sikhs and foreshadows the regime's deceit and pretenses. The Sikhs, as a community, were a lawless people and were thus a menace to the law abiding Hindus in the province. The deputy commissioners are hereby called upon to take special measures against them. You are also instructed that no Sikh will cross Ambala. Keep these germs and bacteria contained between Wagha border and Ambala. This memo demonstrates the dishonesty that led to major tensions based on prior guarantees from government officials. The Sikh community expected to exert political control over Punjab with minimal obligations to the central government. However, as time passed, the Sikhs became increasingly wary that the Indian government did not intend to fulfill its promises. In 1950, the Congress party affirmed the suspicions by declaring their decision to subject Punjab a heavily centralized government administration. In a trend that would become all too familiar in this narrative, the Sikhs protested vehemently and peacefully, yet their demands for recognition remained unanswered and unaddressed. As the newborn nation organized itself, state lines within India were drafted according to linguistic boundaries. In essence, a state was created for each community that spoke a distinctive language. Punjab presented a unique situation in which politics was intimately intertwined with religion. If the Punjabi language was granted its own state in the northwest, the Sikh would compromise a majority of the population. This troubled the central government because a majority Sikh state would give the community a political voice that would demand acknowledgement by any political force intending to wield power within the state of Punjab. Thus, for political reasons, the Congress government sought to avoid the creation of this majority Sikh Punjabi state and instead pushed for a mixed Hindu-Sikh or Hindi-Punjabi state. As state lines were established, government propaganda proclaiming Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan convinced Hindus that the Hindi language was an important and endangered identity marker that required safeguarding. Therefore, in the census 1951, many Punjabi-speaking Hindus claimed Hindi as their mother tongue so as to preserve the language in the face of an apparent threat against their culture and identity. As a result, Punjab was given bilingual status to accommodate both Punjabi and Hindi, despite the fact that the vast majority of Punjabis exclusively spoke the former. This issue of language is important and deserves further attention. Most generally, language is the means by which individuals communicate. It serves to bind communities, forge alliances, and at times create resistance. Language is therefore a matter of ethnic identity, unity, and necessity. Without this connection, the advancement of societies and their abilities to oppose oppression would cease. As David Crystal states, language is more than a shared code of symbol for communication. People do not fight and die as they have done in India to preserve a set of symbols. They do so because they feel that their identity is at stake. That language preservation is a question of human rights, community status, and nationhood. Denied these freedoms, the Sikhs were repressed politically and culturally. While Punjabis demanded recognition of their language in order to preserve their heritage and identity, the contemporary politicians felt that the demand for a Punjabi-based state was an unreasonable call for autonomy, despite the fact that precisely the same criteria determined the boundaries for the other states of India. Officials of the Indian government argued that such demands indicated a separatist and anti-national Sikh sensibility. Such moves, taken to suppress any indication of nonconformism, are not without precedent. For centuries, the rich diversity of India has been celebrated, yet homogenized. Efforts to normalize any variation have sought to eliminate diverse elements by taking them under a larger umbrella. For its inception, Brahmanism has strived to engulf opposition, example Buddhism, Jainism, by swallowing differences into its fold. Inderjit Jaiji comments on the challenges of survival faced by minority religions in India. Religions which lacked any support base outside the country were soon assimilated into the amorphous matrix of Hinduism. This is what happened to the Indian Buddhists in the early centuries of this millennium. It happened to the Jains and the Lingayats as well. After independence, the various indigenous religio-cultural tribal groups felt the tendrils of Hinduism tighten around them. This challenge confronted the Sikhs in the 20th century as ethno-nationalism swept through post-colonial India. As mentioned previously, resistance to such homogenizing efforts were labeled as separatism or terrorism, and Sikh efforts to maintain a distinct religious identity were received with great resistance. As Ranbir Singh Sandhu explains in Struggle for Justice, many Hindus hold the description of the Sikh faith being distance from Hindu as a mark of hostility. In Tragedy of Punjab, Kuldeep Nair and Khushwant Singh further describe how many Hindus were offended by statements made by Akalis that suggested the distinct nation statues of the Sikhs. The Indian Constitution, the pillar of the world's largest democracy, reflects the massive efforts to assimilate the Sikh faith along with other religious traditions. According to Article 25 of the Indian Constitution, Sikhs, Jains and Buddhists are officially recognized as sects of Hinduism. Despite the unmistakable distinctions between the two religious traditions, the government unabatedly continues its attempts to dilute the identity of the Sikhs by placing them under a larger religious umbrella, stating that they are Hindus. It is under this umbrella that Sikhs are denied their own political and cultural autonomy. In the 1940s, the Indian Congress violated the promise that the constitution would not be drafted and implemented without the consent of the Sikhs, as well as Prime Minister Nehru's assurance that legislation would help preserve the Punjabi culture and language. Based on these retractions, the representative of the Sikh community to the Constituent Assembly refused to sign the Indian Constitution. When reminded of his promises to the Sikhs, Nehru simply reminded, "The Sikhs have missed the bus." The troubles of discrimination against minority communities had only begun for the young Indian nation when China invaded the Indian border in 1962. 3 years later, in 1965, India declared war on Pakistan. In both the cases, the Sikhs played a crucial role in the national defense and security, just as they had in the struggle against the British. Following their services in these conflicts, the Sikhs reiterated their demands for a Punjabi-speaking state. This time, with much public endorsement, after 10 years of passionate lobbying, Punjabi was named the official language of the state. It was the last of the 14 languages recognized by Schedule 8 of the Indian Constitution to receive its own statehood. While it finally seemed that the Sikh state of affairs was progressing, the Indian government implemented further legislation to impede its progress. Indira Gandhi and G.L. Nanda spearheaded the Punjab Reorganization Act of 1966, which significantly and adversely impacted the region. The act gave control of the pivotal river waters in agriculture-based Punjab to the centralized Indian government. which proceeded to strip the state of its water rights and distributed the most valuable and vital sources to neighboring states. It also dissected Punjab into three parts, leaving it a mere fraction of its original size. The Congress deprived the Sikhs of the land and water they had been promised and thereby divested Punjab's economy potential. With nearly 75% of the water resources and strategically located cities being redistricted into the other areas, the state and its people were denied the prospect of success in the traditional foundation of Punjab's economy, agriculture. After contributing greatly to India's independence movement and international wars, the Sikhs were rewarded only with a geographically fractured and linguistically divided state that was dispossessed of its agricultural resources. The Sikhs had spurned opportunities for an independent land, holding on to expectations for freedom and equality. However, as the political boundaries were drawn, the Indian government made their anti-Sikh leanings evident, laying the foundation for political dissatisfaction and unrest. Thank you so much for listening to this audiobook. The next chapters in my next videos.